The seeds. The king was growing old, and he knew he would not live very long. He had a son to take his place, but the boy was too young to govern by himself. He feared that the kingdom might not prosper. He decided to appoint an advisor from among the courtiers who surrounded him. He called 3 of them together and explained that he was looking for a worthy advisor to his son after he had passed away. He handed each of them a tiny seed and told them to go away and grow the seed and return in 6 months to show him what had grown. When they returned 6 months later, the king asked them to show him the results of their efforts. 2 of them showed him pots in which a healthy plant had grown, each bearing luxuriant flowers. "Lovely," said the king, "but what of your seed?" he asked the 3rd man. The fellow showed what he had been holding behind his back, a flower pot empty except for the soil. "I am afraid I have failed, your majesty," he said. "Oh, on the contrary," said the king, "you will advise my son." Later, the boy asked his father why he had chosen the failure to advise him. "The 2 who brought healthy plants were both cheats. I gave all 3 seeds that I had boiled. They were dead and could not grow. But one of them is an honest man. He is the best one to advise the king."
Hello and welcome to another one of our little video services. Some of you I know have watched them because I can see online how many clicks we've had on YouTube. But I hope a few of you are listening, because this is the effort that we have to rely on now until our church is reopened. Some years ago, I was working with some churches in the West Country. I attended a meeting of ministers and lay pastors in Bridgewater. I hadn't been around there very long, and I hadn't yet learned the ropes. During the sharing session, I began telling a story I had heard from my psychotherapist. I can't now remember what it was, but that doesn't matter. And after the meeting, a colleague approached me and said in this earnest tone, "You got away with that here, but for God's sake, don't mention that in your congregation." "Mention what?" I said. His answer was halting and embarrassed. "About seeing, your therapist." He had a hard time saying the word, but I was amazed. "Why not?" I asked. "Because people around here will stop listening to you if they think you've got mental health issues." I tried explaining to him that I didn't consider myself to have any sort of mental disturbance, that I used the experience with my Jungian therapist as a guide to my own inner life, and that was for me a spiritual experience. "That's another thing," my colleague said. "Try not to be so American." Things have changed a lot since then. When I last spoke with this guy, he was happily burbling away about his own therapist. He didn't seem at all American either. And though it may still be the case that some people attach a sense of shame about getting help from a counselor or a therapist, I find that most people have begun to understand the process a lot better. Ever since C.G. Jung broke with his mentor, Sigmund Freud, about the motivating factors in human psychology, we have seen the emergence of what some people call sacred psychology. having spent a lifetime comparing the deepest myths of peoples all over the world, he was able to bring back an idea that had long existed in the mystical literature of the great world religions. When that old white guy, aka God, fell off his perch, he left a very big hole in human thinking. Early scientists had ground lenses to peer at him off in space where heaven was imagined to be, but they couldn't find him up there. Now, when we can gaze on trillions of galaxies that comprise the universe, he's even less visible to the physical eye. The new wave of thinkers began to listen to older voices which said that God, or the kingdom of heaven, or ultimate meaning, you can choose the synonym that suits you best, that this final source of being not out there, but in here. And suddenly it seemed that what had begun as a way to control the behavior of crazy people had evolved into a point of resolution of truths from every direction. So once you've got the idea that God is to be found within, the whole approach to sacred experience takes on a new form. One definition of the divine is this: infinite consciousness. Sacred psychology turns itself to the gradual unfolding of consciousness from the limited, personal, and individual to the infinite, transpersonal, and universal. Because none of us are separate from the divine, there must be a route back through the consciousness of each of us to the source, just as leaves are connected to the main trunk of the tree. What has emerged is that there is indeed a route, but there are no shortcuts. Sacred psychology would have us re-examine the stories of the ancients, see with new eyes the words of poets and mystics from everywhere in the world, and begin a new approach to ritual and ceremony. It would be a mistake to view sacred psychology as a new theory of life. Rather, it's a window through which all the various and sometimes even apparently contrasting experiences of humanity can, in fact, be reconciled. To understand this better, I rely on a Sufi metaphor. It's the image of the pearl diver who wishes to find the pearl of great price. Now, there are various sorts of divers. There are those who stand on the beach and who gaze longingly at the sea, wishing they did have the courage to dive. There are those who actually put their feet into the ocean, but the cold water and the fear of the strong tides keep them just paddling in the shallows. And there are those few whose longing for the pearl of great price grows so great that it makes them dive deeply and abandon the safety of dry land. Well, sacred psychology is the milieu of the deep diver. Those who are willing to go down where things seem dangerous and foreign into their own inner being. The paddlers are those who have an experience of the sea, but who are driven back in fear. And those who stay on the beach, well, this is where most of us live our lives, wishing for meaning, even knowing where it might lie, but just too timid to take the plunge. Well, this would be okay. There's plenty to do here on the beach after all. It would be all right, except for one thing. Carl Jung said it, but so did teachers and poets and avatars from every age. There is an unquenchable impulse for consciousness to break through the shell of small self and to know itself finally as the one true self in all. We have all been on a very long journey, longer than we can imagine. We are more conscious than the seashells at our feet, more conscious than the gulls wheeling overhead, and there's something in us that urges us on to bring out of the depth of unconsciousness that pearl of self-consciousness. And it just won't let us relax forever, much as we might like it on the shore. But sacred psychology isn't just about theory. It's about practice, and that toughest task of all, what some people now call soul work. For this reason, it doesn't ignore the apparently prosaic demands of ordinary life. In fact, the ordinariness of life is what gives soul work its authority. Even the restrictions that we have found during the pandemic's lockdown will have their own secret meaning for us, will transform themselves into soul work if we but understand what we're doing. We can't all just sail off into the wild blue yonder, or if you prefer, scuba dive straight out of sight. There are children to feed, houses to build, friends to meet, lovers to adore. And it's in just this ordinary arena that the opportunities for real pearl diving emerge. It's becoming clear to many depth psychologists that symptoms of the mental and physical kind are not just annoyances to be got over. If we're anxious without cause, if we're depressed, gripped by addiction, hobbled by backache, headache, obesity, anorexia, these are not just troubles, but signs from the unconscious part of ourselves. I don't mean to say that all physical symptoms are psychosomatic, very far from it. But I do mean that there is something in our condition that is really a kind of soulful road sign that points in the direction of our growth. The way we deal with these things, these humble things, points to the differences between the beachcombers, those paddling on the shore, and the deep divers. At a certain point in life, each of us begins to realize that we're not entirely whole. Why do we avoid certain situations and feel mysteriously fearful when we're confronted with them? Why does vague illness or fatigue hamper our best laid plans? Why do we set up circles of collaborators who will tell us how wonderful we are and wonder why our enemies don't understand us? Why do we set up routines of a magical kind and feel depressed when they're disrupted? Why didn't I write that novel, sail that boat, visit my grandmother in hospital? I think there's no one who doesn't have reason to believe that he or she is incomplete in some way, or even possibly lost. And when this feeling of incompleteness grows strong enough, we may turn our eyes toward the sea where the pearl is submerged. We may go to see someone as that euphemism has it. I would prefer to think that the blessing of the symptom has forced us into the deep water, and we have at last begun to look for the pearl of meaning. Well, in case you're wondering, this is not an appeal for everybody to rush out and make an appointment with a shrink tomorrow morning. It's a suggestion that each one of us begins to look more boldly at the lives we have chosen for ourselves and to make an honest appraisal of our needs. And should we find that we are ready to begin to dive for that pearl, we might find someone to go with us, to give us diving lessons, to hold our hands. If we've begun to see that this journey leads us back to ourselves, not to some unknown destination, we may feel more like braving the surf. And if we can see that this investigation of the soul is not a medical remedy, but actually a different form of prayer, then we may feel that it is not so different at all from what we tune into things like this for, or what we go to church for. Let's call them diving lessons.